One of the enduring questions or issues in philosophy and spirituality is really the issue of what is the self? Who am I? They sound like huge, deep and profound issues. To sometimes it might sound a little bit like cheesy and, isn't that a little bit, whether it be self-indulgent or overly abstract or whatever. But there's no doubt that the purpose of philosophy and of our spiritual practices is indeed to discover who we are, to discover how it is that we're in this world. What is this world? All of these questions have plagued us since the most ancient of times. Much of philosophy has been spent trying to understand the self in order to make us accept our lives, ourselves, much better. We could do countless shows and fill countless volumes on what is the self and almost what should we do about the self. As you know, on this show, I talk a lot about Stoic philosophy, which particularly interests me as being an ancient philosophy that's so well suited to the modern mind and the modern world. And what I'm going to do tonight is just touch on a few of the issues raised by the Stoics, especially old favorite Marcus Aurelius, in looking at issues about what is the self. We're never going to address the whole issue, even with the Stoics. Marcus himself repeatedly circles around and gets back to that subject because his whole thesis is that the meditating self, the contemplation of who am I and how do I manage this better. Because what drives the Stoics and many other philosophers is that the self seems to suffer and struggle with this world that we find ourselves in. And so part of the question of what is the self is a little bit like saying, since the world is so difficult and full of suffering, what is the self? How can it be? What are we supposed to do with all of that? So tonight we'll just take one or two aspects of Marcus Aurelius's answer to that in dealing with how do we understand what is the self, or how do we define that, and what do we do about the difficulty in being this self in this world, which seems to be on an altogether different agenda. One of the ways we are, of course, all aware of the self is through this inner dialogue, the inner voice that we all have, that essentially is providing pretty much a running commentary on our lives. It is our thought processes, sure, but there's this constant examination of what's going on, a commentary, a monologue about it, interpretations of what's going on. Sometimes that inner self is happy and supportive and helps us feel stronger, and frequently that inner voice is critical and negative and even in the end rather self-defeating. So, we refer to that as self-talk. Psychologists call that self-talk, talking to myself, or the self-talking. And it's a mixture, if you like, of how I know myself to be and what I'm doing in the world and finding myself in the world. And of course, lots of unconscious beliefs and unconscious desires and unconscious biases are all in that dialogue. Perhaps it is a way that we interpret and process our daily experiences. Doing that seems to be something very necessary for human beings, so much so that we even believe that we do that in our sleep through dreams. It seems so necessary for us to constantly understand and process our experience in the world that we could argue that the question of who is the self, perhaps the answer of who is the self, is one of the most important reasons to be. And of course, many spiritual teachers argue exactly that. A lot of spiritual philosophy from the East, for example, is based around the idea of self-realization, making the self real, realizing who the self is. And we can talk about breaking the illusions of the world and realizing who you really are, and that you're not a physical body, and all of those things which come to us from the great spiritual teachers, definitely is a way of dealing with this ongoing process of trying to figure out what we are or who we are that seems to be built into us. We don't know if animals do the same thing. It's probable that they don't do it, at least in exactly the way that we do. But certainly for us, it makes us to a certain extent discontented with who we are and our life on earth. And so some of our unhappiness also comes from this troubling question of, who am I? What am I? What am I doing here? All of those are the questions that revolve around who is the self. The function of that inner voice, that inner self-dialogue, may very well be in order to help us process things, but it's probably also to help us deal with things. You know, we can be at our best when that inner voice is positive and helping us overcome fears and bolstering our confidence and pushing us up, because it is true that as human beings we are prone to negative self-talk. But that negative self-talk seems to be very powerful. I am a complete failure. I'm useless at this. Even when it's self-deprecating and it's the process of being humble. You know, I had a client say to me the other day, speaking of herself, I'm such an idiot because I can't manage the computer. To which I replied, you know, a computer is a pile of plastic and glass and metal and all of that. Calling yourself an idiot because you can't manage that or run that is just a way of talking yourself down. And the problem is that those kind of statements, as simple as it seems, I never do anything right, I'm always such a failure, we tend to believe them even when they are such sweeping statements that they couldn't possibly be true. The woman who told me that she was an idiot has an advanced business degree and has been incredibly successful in her life. Is that what an idiot is? Certainly, at the very least, we can recognize the destructiveness of that voice, and especially the perhaps milder version that most of us are experiencing, which we can call the inner critic that constantly judges and criticizes. Perhaps another way of looking at this is that we are really the narrators of our own life stories, that our process of trying to understand who we are is achieved through this narration of ourself. I mean, after all, if you look at the narrator in a book or in a movie, they're there to share their experience and try and make us connect to their experience, to explain who they are, so that in understanding them, we accept them or we accept their story, and perhaps we understand ourselves in the process, one of the important functions of narrative. So maybe the constant narration of our story to ourselves can go beyond the mere self-critic and is in fact an effort for us to accept ourselves and understand ourselves. It's not only about figuring out who I am, but it's also being able to accept who I am. But that's not always how we spend our energy. I mean, a lot of how we try and deal with the problems that we face in our lives and the problems that we face in our world and in our relationships is by trying to deal with the other people, by trying to change the other people. We often think if only that person would be different or that circumstance would be different, then we'd be able to change ourselves. All the other people are these other characters in that film or book or that narrative of our lives. And by constantly trying to change the other people, we're not really going to change our own world. If you were talking about a work of literature or a movie, change must focus around the main character in order for the narrative to change. So the way that we change our lives, whatever we are trying to do with it, is by changing ourselves. one of the most fundamental understandings of what the self is. Even if we can't understand the spiritual mystery of it, we can certainly agree from everything I've said, it's the main character in that narrative. And if you understand that you are the main character in your narrative, you are the one who is telling yourself things, then you are able to change the narrative by changing yourself. Changing yourself is certainly easier said than done, but the work that we do on our feelings, on our relationships, on our everyday lives, if we do it by starting at ourselves and looking at how our behavior in that situation could be different, we might end up changing our sense of ourselves. After all, again, looking at that work of literature or that movie, changing the narrative, the character does something differently. So maybe if we do something differently, we begin to understand, we begin to change our sense of who we are. And that starts giving us insight into who am I and how is my control of my life actually affecting my experience of my life. Because that is Marcus Aurelius's argument, the Stoics' argument about how do we find ourselves. We might ask the question, is the self the same as the identity, as the ego? What exactly, where are the lines drawn? Where is the delimitation of the self? And it's that delimitation of the self that is one of the most basic and important exercises in Stoicism. And that's why we're going to look to the Stoics to look for an answer to that. Once we understand the delimitations of ourself, our attitudes, our consciousness, our bodies, our selves, our possessions, the past, the present, fate itself, our relationships, everything can change once we understand, once we change the idea of what our self is, or once we understand the limits of what our self is, because that is Marcus Aurelius's argument. He says if we circumscribe what the self is and look at it like in particular categories, we can get a much better grip over understanding the self. Firstly, he says that there are three things that we are composed of: your body, your breath, and your mind. If you could release the mind, cut it free from what other people do or say, or even if what you have said or done, or of the things that you're afraid will happen, if you can cut yourself free of the impositions of the body, and if you could cut yourself free of the impositions of the breath, and of what fate brings from outside, so that the mind is free of fate, and is free of the body, and is clear and able to live life on its own terms, doing what is right and accepting what happens, then we would be living in ourself. We would be self-aware, self-conscious, and self-realized. Remember that the main underlying principle of Stoicism, which really also is about the definition of the self, is that you need to distinguish between that which you're in control of and that which you are not in control of. So that is the very core thing that guides most of what we do in terms of thinking stoically. The first step in delineating where the self is recognizing that the body and the breath, which earlier were defined as distracting us from ourselves, the body and the breath are not actually authentically yours. You didn't go out and buy them, no one gave them to you, you didn't make them yourself, you don't even exactly know what they are. They can do things of their own, they do things without your permission, and they can end suddenly without telling you, without warning. Clearly, the body and the breath are imposed on us by destiny, or whatever it is, outside of us. So that's the first thing we understand. My body and the life in it, the breath in it, isn't actually mine. That isn't me. I didn't make this. The second thing is then recognize that given that, they clearly are mine to take care of. So we need to recognize that it is my duty to myself to look after this body, this breath, this life in some way, because they kind of are given to me. But the choice to look after them does belong to you. They might not be exactly yours. This body, this breath is not exactly yours, but looking after them does belong to you. What is yours is your mind. And the Stoics say that's really the only part of you that is yours. And with your mind, you make the choice to look after the body and breath. Self-preservation, instinct to live. The great Stoic teacher, Epictetus, he was Marcus Aurelius' teacher, says, what is really ours? Purify your judgments so that nothing that is not yours may become attached to you or become part of your life, so that you don't feel any suffering when it's gone, when it's snatched away from you. Think about that, especially with regards to other people, but so many of the circumstances that we face in our lives and the things that other people do. When you disconnect and realize, well, that isn't me and that isn't mine, there's no reason for me to suffer if it goes, because it was never part of my life. Marcus Aurelius has a very pragmatic approach to understanding the delimitation of the self. He says there are 4 circles that surround the self, that circumscribe us, that define who we are and define who the self is. And if we break those 4 circles, we will succeed in discovering the self. The first of those circles is the outermost circle. And the outermost circle deals with other people. We could say this is the social circle. And that which surrounds us, the people that surround us, occupy our thoughts and our behaviors to a very large degree. We are continuously worrying and wondering what other people are doing. We consistently worry about what they think about us, what they're doing kind of behind our backs, or things which have got nothing directly to do with us. We have so many possible questions about other people, says Marcus Aurelius, that they make you dizzy inside and turn you away from the attention which you should be paying to your own self, or guiding principle, that voice that we hear. So Marcus says, stop looking at other people, stop worrying about what they're thinking and saying and doing and what's going on in their minds and what they're plotting behind your back. It's challenging enough to have to concern yourself only with yourself. So concern yourself, with that voice of criticism, and getting back to where do you lie in that self that's commenting on and guiding your life. That's the voice that you should be worrying about, not that of other people in the outer circle. The second circle that circumscribes us is the past and the future. If we are to become aware of ourselves, we must focus on the present. Our past words, our past actions no longer belong to us. We are not doing that thing. We are not saying that thing anymore, even if it was just yesterday. That which is in the past does not belong to us. It's gone. Effectively, we can't even say where it is. It's only in our memory. The past doesn't actually exist except in our memory. We can see the effects of it. We can remember it, but we can't locate it. So we need to pull ourselves out of the past, because if we try and locate ourselves in the past, which is an invisible black hole that doesn't really exist and we can't really find, we're going to lose ourselves exactly the way that the past is lost. But we tend to focus on past sufferings, and we tend to focus on future fears. Seneca, another great Stoic philosopher, says, The past no longer concerns me, and the future does not yet concern me. Only the present is within my power. It's only in the present that you're capable of acting. I mean, it's obvious, but it is profound. If you think about it, I can't act on the future, it isn't here yet, and I can't act on the past because it's gone. So the regrets or the recriminations or all of those things make no sense, and the hopes and fears make no sense about the future. All I can do is concentrate on what is within my power. If we concentrate on acting and living in the present, we are acting and living in ourselves. The third circle, which circumscribes us, says Marcus Aurelius, are emotions. These are instinctive, they're involuntary, they're based often on fear, on the unknown, on things that aren't even going to last that long. But the emotions that affect us and how they affect us, we don't really agree, we don't give our approval, our assent to that. They cause disturbances of the mind, of the body. We get completely upset by them. When I say emotions, I'm not talking about our feelings or our relationships, it's our reactions, our strong reactions. We react excessively, and we basically are not in control of those emotions. But we aren't those emotions, clearly. If we don't feel in control of them, if they're instinctive and involuntary, if they cause such pain and suffering for us, they're not us. They affect us. So they are one of the things that are not the self, just like other people and the past and the future. Our emotions are not ourselves. And finally, says Marcus, the fourth circle is destiny, or time itself. Events will come and go in constant flux. Our emotions are stirred by them, and the body is caught in it. But if we are self-aware, we realize that the self, the mind, where the awareness lies, stands apart from all of it, because we can watch it go by. We can see the past flow through the present to the future and imagine that. We can remember, we can fear, we can feel, we can see all of those things changing all the time. So then we realize, well, then that isn't me, because I'm still me, I'm not changing. So by watching that go by and seeing the flux go by, I understand that none of those things are me. Because here I stand, feeling exactly the same, being this very same person that I've always been, watching the self, watching the flux of the world go by. We stand apart from the flux. Therefore, says Marcus, the self is the same as the guiding principle. It is the same as that inner voice which is watching. It is the same as where that location of consciousness lies. It is raised above destiny, says Marcus. Destiny might make me sick or poor. It might make me hungry. It makes me die on a certain day. But in the end, what I think about those things is pretty much anything I like. I can change what I think about these things. I can refuse to see them as misfortunes, he says. This is the self above destiny. The self is not other people. The self is not the past or the future. The self is not the emotions. The self is not destiny or time, because it observes all of those things. That narrative that is so capable of being destructive is the self. He says, when the self thus becomes aware of its freedom, it acts only by making its reason coincide with the reason of universal nature. It wants what universal nature wants. The self then will tell the truth, both inwardly and outwardly. It acts without value judgment. It recognizes that everything that does not depend on my own moral choice is indifferent, and therefore not in its control. And it acts for the common good rather than for the individual. In a nutshell, once we recognize that we are not those four things, once we recognize that that inner voice is us and it has the freedom to choose how it deals with those four things, then we are liberated and we can put the self to better use than self-criticism. Philosophy also shows us that for every question we ask, a new question arises. And I suspect that for every question, what is the self, the new question that arises is, but what is the self? A question that we never quite answer, but by continuously dancing around it and considering what we've been told by the great Stoics and others, maybe we can learn in the end to be, how do I be with myself, given what the self is or has to face in the world? Too many questions. I'll be back next week at the same time. See you then.